Hey there, so I'm going to show you guys a little bit of about using your camera and some basics on the functions of your camera. So using manual functions and how to think about how the camera works, and just the basic uses of using an SLR camera. So if you have experience using an SLR camera in manual mode, then you can skip over this video or just reference this as a review or fast forward, however you need to, whatever you feel like is appropriate for you and where you are. I am aware that a lot of you have experience in photography, but many of you do not have a lot of experience using an SLR camera, and so I just want to make sure that all of you are on the same level as far as knowing how to use the functions of your camera. So first, before I show you like what all of these buttons do, this is actually one of my first cameras. I found it at my parents' house. And well, one of my first digital cameras when I was starting as a career as a photographer. And this camera is not necessarily, super expensive or anything. I can't remember I think I paid $1,200 for it, which was pretty cheap at the time. And I wanted to use this camera. Now you could probably get it on eBay for maybe $200-300. I wanted to show you how you can still take a really nice photograph, even not using one of the cameras that we have in the equipment room that's like $5,000. So just to give you a reference on what kind of camera I'm using, and you'll find that a lot of even the older cameras have all of the same functions if you use it in manual mode. And there's some limitations in regards to like ISO and what kind of lenses you can use and that kind of thing, as well as the frame per second. So when you hear that that the camera sound makes, that's the frames per second. Some of the older cameras can't go very fast when you have, when you're shooting like a sporting event and that kind of thing, where someone's, has a soccer ball and they're running right past you and you want to have that really fast shutter speed so you get the perfect image. Some of those older cameras are kind of slow, so you might get 3 images versus 30, like you would in some of the newer ones. So when you're looking at when you're first, introduced to your camera, I want you to think about the basics of how the first camera worked. So if you've taken any kind of film class, using film, like a film camera class, you'll know that everything about the original camera, it starts with light. So all of the manual functions have most of them have some sort of aspect of light. So they have some sort of control of how much light comes in and how that light is captured. So on a film camera, the light is captured on the film. So film is made to respond to light. So there are these very, very small particles on the film that once the light is exposed on the film, those chemicals will actually turn over. And so those spots on the film that receive light will turn over, and the more light that is exposed onto the film, the actual 35 millimeter film or whatever millimeter film, the brighter it is. So digital cameras are very, very similar. Everything about this camera is just like those film cameras, with the exception of instead of film, there is a little computer chip that reads that light. And that's why we don't need to put film in here. The computer can read all of those images. So everything inside is similar. You'll notice that when you push the button, it sounds really similar to a film camera, where you can hear that click, click. There is a mirror inside that's doing that. Before I get into that, I just want you to look at your camera, and I want you to place it on an M. It more than likely has an M, depending on your camera, whether it's a dial or it's on a screen, or you have to use this. Canon's, a lot of time, most of the menu is here on the screen. You can't see it on top. So find that function. A lot of times you'll see like if you can see on my camera, you'll see an M and an A and an S and a P. So it'll probably be near one of those letters. So place it on the M, and then that'll give you full control of what your camera does. Most SLR cameras these days, if you put it on auto, it will do pretty well. But I want you guys to know how to use the manual functions, just so if you're in a situation where the auto function is just, it's not working, you're getting a really dark image, or your camera it's not as smart as you are, obviously. So if you're trying to take a picture of something specific, and it's on an auto function, it might take a picture of the frame of the window instead of what's outside, for example, or it might take measure the light of the floor rather than the person, standing on the floor or sitting on the floor. So I want you to have the availability of knowing how to use that manual function. So there are 3 things about your camera that will determine the light. So when I say the light, another word for that is exposure. I'm sure you've heard that in regards to using a camera. So exposure is determined in your camera by the aperture, or some people call it the f-stop. So the aperture is 1, as well as the shutter speed is 2, and the third one is ISO. So ISO, normally you keep it on a similar setting, but that also determines the light. So the 2 main things are aperture and shutter speed. So I'll first talk about aperture. So aperture is very similar to the pupil of your eye. So when you go outside, for example, and it's really, really bright outside, what does your pupil do? The black part of your eye, it gets smaller, right? So what's happening is the pupil in your eye recognizes that there's a lot of light, and in order for your retina to not get burned or get blinded, the pupil will get smaller so that less light can come in. So very similar to that. And then the opposite is true when you are in a very dark room. Your pupil will get larger because it's trying to receive as much light as possible so you can see, whatever available light that exists in the room, that you'll be able to see it. So very, very similar to that is the aperture in your camera. And you'll notice that it will look very mechanical, where the very one way to think about the measurement of the aperture, it's a little bit backwards. So the smaller the opening is, the larger the f-stop is. So what's happening is it's measuring between the opening of the aperture and the edge of your frame, of your lens. So that measurement is larger, but the hole in which the light can come in is much smaller. So opposite of that, if you are in a really dark room or a really dark setting, the aperture is much larger. Therefore, the measurement between the opening of the aperture and the edge of the frame is much smaller. So the aperture is much smaller. And you'll notice, take a look at your camera, and you'll notice that there should be some numbers at the top of your lens. There will be a number that says, whatever to whatever millimeter, and then there's another one that has possibly a number that's like 3 point something to 5 point something. I think the most common is 3.5 to 5.6. It's a very common aperture, stock lens. So what that is referring to is that the lowest the f-stop can go on my camera specifically, it's 3.5 to 4.5. The lowest that the aperture can go down to is 3.5. So that is the most open the aperture can get in like a dark room or in a dark setting. And that's a pretty typical aperture number. Some of my favorite lenses have even lower numbers because it gives me more of a variety of situations that I can be in. Some really, some of my favorite lenses are 1.4 to 1.8, and those also give you a really nice depth of field too, which I'll talk about later. So, whenever you are adjusting your aperture on your camera, you can see that the lowest that it will go. So you can see on my camera, the lowest it will go is 3.5. And test that on your camera. It depends on your camera. Some Canons will have a little dial right here, and you'll have to hold one of the buttons on top to adjust the aperture. You can also possibly do it on the menu. So if you're using a Nikon, it's much easier. It's just a little dial here at the top, and you can adjust your aperture. So you can pause this video and take a picture using the lowest setting of your camera. So for mine, 3.5, take a picture and then adjust it to a higher setting, to possibly like 20 aperture, which is a very, very small opening, and test it in different rooms. So if you're at home, test it in your bedroom, and then do the exact same thing outside. And you'll see a difference on how it captures the light, as well as you might even see a difference on as far as how much depth there is in your photograph. So what you'll probably see, what you should see when you take these pictures is that at 3.5, or the lowest setting you have, in a room like this, which is lamplit, it should be a pretty clear picture, depending on your shutter speed, but more than likely it'll be something recognizable. You'll be able to see something. But outside it might be really, really white, or just really overexposed. So, and then with the higher aperture, if you take a picture with, say, f-stop 22 inside this room that's lamplit, there's a good chance that it's just going to be black. It's just going to be a really dark picture, as opposed to outside, where you might be able to see some clouds, see some sort of something besides just white, as opposed to the 3.5 aperture. So play around with the aperture, like the settings, and see, both inside and outside, if you can get a clear picture of, a well-exposed picture, and kind of record either mentally or on paper what setting that it was on, both inside and outside, which setting worked for you, which setting made the best exposure. So the second thing is shutter speed. So shutter speed also determines your exposure. Shutter speed refers to that little sound that you hear when you push the button where it goes ch-ch. So what is happening is your the computer chip is not reading anything until you push that button. As soon as you push that button, there is the mirror, which is capturing the frame that you're pointing at, whatever you're pointing at. The mirror will reflect onto the computer chip, or if it's a film camera, onto the film. So as soon as it opens, it's capturing the image and then closing it. So, like I said, it depends on how much light you want to have the camera see. So if it's really fast, then it's more than likely there's a lot of light outside. So you don't want to leave it open too long, because then it'll be overexposed. That it'd be too much light coming into the camera if it's really bright outside. However, if it's really dark inside, then you can let it open up a little bit longer. So if you see, if you look at your settings, you'll see that on my camera it says 2000. That's 1/2000th of a second that the shutter is open. So once it opens, the time measurement is 1/2000th of a second. So that's pretty quick. And you can pull it down to pretty much as low as you want, but you don't want to get it too low. So if you can listen to the shutter, I'm going to take a picture. Oh, just kidding. It's not focusing. It's trying to focus. You can hear that is pretty slow. But if I make it 1/2000th, that was on 1/10th of a second. But if I place it on 1/2000th of a second, that's much quicker, right? So there's less light that's coming in. Oh, and you can actually see something. So you can see this was the last photo I took. Or the first photo that I took. There's a lot of light in there because the shutter was open for a long time. But for the second one, it's just, I'm in a closet right now, so it's the shelf of the closet. You can actually make out something in the photograph. This is 1/2000th of a second. And this is 1/10th of a second, so there's a lot more light coming in. So play around with your shutter speed as well. So those two things go together fairly well. One thing that that is different about shutter speed as opposed to aperture, so both aperture and shutter speed will affect your lighting, but it also affects other things. So for shutter speed, a rule of thumb with me is that I don't need to put in my shutter speed anywhere below 1/60th of a second. The reason being is that that is slow enough that it will actually record. When the shutter's open, if I'm moving even slightly, it will smear. I call it smear the image. So you'll hear me say blur or smear. Blur means there's something wrong with your lens, like you don't have it focused correctly. Smear is where your shutter speed is open so long that the light kind of smears after, if either because you are moving or the object you're taking a picture of is moving. So especially, I've taken a lot of pictures of people at events who are dancing, for example. And a lot of times those events are very low lit. There's low lighting, candle lighting kind of thing. And so if the shutter speed, even at 1/60th of a second, if people are moving fairly fast, they're going to smear onto the frame because they're moving so fast that the shutter speed can't open and close fast enough. So whenever you're taking a photograph in something really low, like 1/60th of a second or lower, the camera needs to be completely still. So placing it on a tripod anywhere below 1/60th of a second is required in order to get a clear image. And the object that you're taking a photograph of needs to be still as well, or fairly still. So so these two elements go together pretty well. So as an exercise, I want you to go out at night and see if you can kind of get an idea of where that smear happens. So maybe taking a photograph of a candle outside and moving your camera around that candle when the shutter speed is on pretty low versus pretty high. And you'll notice that one reason why I say below 1/60th of a second is because even though I have pretty trained still hands. I'm not shaky. I can get my camera really, really still at 1/60th of a second, and sometimes I've even gotten it as still as 1/30th of a second, which I'm pretty proud of. But I don't have shaky hands. If you guys have had any coffee, you might want to go like 1/100th of a second. But if I'm shaky at all around that slow of a shutter speed, then it will smear. So anything below 1/60th of a second, I will place it on a table or a shelf, or if I'm taking pictures of the stars, I'll leave it on a tripod, or I rarely use tripods. I try to find like a table or a rock or something to place it on, because he wants to carry around a tripod all the time. Not me. Especially in photojournalism, where you're, nothing's in a studio. You're moving around a lot. You're going on location everywhere. So you can also practice with the stars. If you place the shutter speed on bulb, if you go all the way down on your shutter speed, you should be able to get to a setting that's just called bulb. That means that you push the button to take the picture, and the frame will open up, and it'll stay open until you push the button again. So for something like stars that are pretty small, like very, very low light, especially if you are, if it's conflicting with, porch lights or city lights or whatever, you'll want to face your camera in a still location, whether it's just sitting on a table, upside down, looking up, or on a tripod. And ideally, because even when you push the button, when you push this button to take the picture in a dark space, on and off, that still shakes the camera just enough that you might see a little line instead of a dot for the star. So practice shutter speed at night, and you can kind of get an idea of how much light comes in specific lighting conditions. So all of these numbers that I've been mentioning, like the aperture, 3.5 aperture, and shutter speed 1/2000th of a second, all those numbers will feel a little more, natural eventually. Like you'll be able to, once you've taken so many pictures on an SLR camera. I've been taking photographs for as a business for 8 years, or as a career for 8 years, and as far as taking pictures just in general for 25 years. So I can go outside and get a pretty good guess at what those numbers should be just looking outside without looking at my camera. And that will kind of come with time. The more pictures you take, the better you'll get at it. There's also a good way of measuring in a lot of your cameras. If you look inside your camera, you'll see a little meter that has a plus on the left side and a minus on the right side. And there should be like a little 0 or something in the middle. The further, the further to the right, to the right, it'll be underexposed, meaning that it's too black, and then too dark for whatever situation you're in. And too far to the left, to the plus sign, means that it'll be too overexposed or too much light's coming in. So it'll be, in worst case scenario, it'll just be all white. But if you get it in the middle, that means that your camera is measuring. And this is your camera, it's not measuring exactly what you're trying to focus on, but your camera measures that the lighting is just right there. So you want that meter to be right there in the middle. So you can take a look at that while you're looking as well. So I know this is a lot of information all at once if you haven't had experience using manual mode on your camera, but and I'm going to talk about ISO in another lesson. But aperture and shutter speed, I want you to just focus on those two things. I'm not against you guys taking pictures in auto whatsoever, but if you are, especially in lower light conditions, like if you were in the chapel even during the day, especially at night if you're in the chapel trying to take photographs on auto. A lot of times the auto will like pop up the flash right here. So let's see if it does it in this room. No, it didn't do it in that room. So this flash might pop up. Flash. Okay, it's not working today, just kidding. The flash might pop up, and you know, if you're in a situation like you're in a very you don't want to have a lot of eyes on you while you're at the front near the stage, and you know there's this flash going on, that might not be an ideal situation for you. So the only alternative is to put it in manual mode and kind of tell the camera what it needs to do. So I want to make sure that you guys have that option. If you ever have that like perfect picture you could get, I want you to be able to know how to use everything. So focus on those two things: shutter speed, aperture. Play around with the different settings. Do like a really low aperture with a really high shutter speed, see what that does. And then also practice in different lighting conditions, whether it's a lamp lit room like this one, or outside when it's like crazy bright, you know, no clouds. Try it again when it's about to rain, where the light is not quite as harsh. Try it in the shade. Try taking pictures also at night in your bedroom, or maybe where there's a lot of fluorescent lights. Kind of see what that does. The more that you practice in various lighting conditions, the more you'll start to understand, like, oh, okay, so this aperture and this shutter speed make more sense for this kind of situation versus when you're outside and it's really bright outside and people are playing sport. I guess nobody's really playing sports right now, but people who are running by fast, and they're much different settings that you'll want to use.